Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, bookworms and literary enthusiasts. It is with a bittersweet note that we welcome you to the final day of the extraordinary 15th edition of the Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival. 3 days of enthralling sessions, captivating discussions, and unforgettable encounters with the written word are culminating in this grand finale. As we raise curtain on this final day, buckle up to witness kaleidoscopic themes with the finest creative minds today. The first session of the 3rd day of the Apeejay Kolkata Literary Festival, titled Of Shapeshifters and Other Worlds, we have with us Carina Rozenfeld, Indrapramit in conversation with Meghna Pant. This event is supported by the Embassy of France, French Institute, alias Francaise du Bengale. Now, may I request Mr. Nicola Fassino, Director of alias Francaise du Bengale, to kindly come up to the podium and say a few words about our association with this esteemed institution and also about the festival. Thank you.
So much for this kind presentation. Bonjour. So the partnership, I would like to start saying that the partnership between the Alliance Francaise du Bengale and the Apeejay Lit Fest in Kolkata marks a significant milestone in our effort to promote literature and cultural exchanges in this vibrant city of Kolkata, the land of literature, of course. So on behalf of the Embassy of France in India, the French Institute in India, and of course, the Alliance Française du Bengale, I extend a warm welcome to Carina Rozenfeld, the French author, a distinguished author renowned for her works in children's literature. Carina Rozenfeld's contribution to the literary world have enriched the lives of readers of all ages, and we are honored to have her join today. This partnership between our organizations not only fosters cross-cultural dialogue, but also strengthens the bonds of friendship between France and India. Through literature, we can transcend borders and unite people from diverse backgrounds in a shared appreciation for the written world. May this partnership between the Alliance Française du Bengale and the Apeejay Lit Fest continue to flourish, bringing joy and enlightenment to audiences for years to come. And I would like to extend my very deep grateful to Anjum, who lead this wonderful festival since I arrived in Kolkata, and it's a great pleasure every time to work with you and your wonderful team. So thank you, and let the celebration begin. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Nicola Fassino. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this session is supported by the Alliance Francaise du Bengale. May we have a huge round of applause for the speakers who we welcome on stage now. To shortly introduce them, French author Carina Rozenfeld excels in children's science fiction and fantasy with over 20 literary awards. Renowned for her French young adult fantasy novels, she is a former journalist who has also contributed to the French television. Indrapramit is a writer and editor from Kolkata. He is a Shirley Jackson Award winner for his short fiction. He has written about books, comics, TV, and film for publications including Slant Magazine, Vogue India, to name a few. Meghna Pant is a renowned author, screenwriter, journalist, and speaker, boasts 8 acclaimed books. Her contribution to literature, gender issues, and journalism have earned her prestigious awards like the Bharat Nirman and Frank O'Connor International Awards. Several of her works, including Boys Don't Cry, are being adapted for the screen. May we now welcome the delegates onto the stage and start off with the conversation. Thank you.
is the craft, the process behind writing fantasy. So we have a very short session today, only 30 minutes. So I'll dive right into it. I'll ask you a few questions, Carina and Indro, and then I'll throw it open to the audience. So if you want to ask any questions, direct them to the authors, please feel free. So Carina and Indro, welcome to the session. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And let's begin with, narrative subversion. Now, fantasy literature either does not follow conventions or tropes, or it's entirely seeped in it. So how do you approach subverting or deconstructing traditional fantasy elements in your work? And do you find there are any challenges or even rewards in pushing against the established norms, particularly in this genre?
Would you like to go first?
Yes. Hello. So I feel very free when I write a book of science fiction, fantasy, everything in the imaginary world. I don't have limitation, or nobody gives me limitation. Even my publisher, I'm just very free to write the story I want to tell. So I just follow my instinct. And I can talk about every topics and every subject, and make my characters live all kind of adventures and situations. And I never felt like people can tell me, no, you can write about this, or you can go this far, and no, never. It's a very free process to write. So I just tell the story I want to tell, and go into my imagination, and even if it can be very light, like funny adventures, and sometimes very dark, and sometimes very serious, but I always do what I want. I never feel like I have barriers or limitation by anybody.
What about you, Indro?
So yeah, I agree that fantasy can be writing fantasy, science fiction, anything non-realist. You don't have any limitations. You can essentially write about anything and any time and any place, and that is wonderful. I was listening to this talk by Susanna Clarke and Alan Moore recently, and they're both legendary writers of genre fiction. And Alan Moore described fantasy as a way of re-enchanting a disenchanted world, and I think that's a perfect way to put it. Because we do live in times that are extremely dark, and history is not very fantastical. So fantasy is a way of a lot of people, and see, it's also difficult to talk about genre fiction because it's a massive umbrella. Lots of different genres fall under it. Science fiction and fantasy are not the same thing, but people can mix the two together, and people also often conflate the two. And I do write across a variety of genres, and as you were asking about tropes and whether we kind of write towards those tropes or subvert them. And I do prefer subversion myself. I grew up reading a lot of reading and watching a lot of fiction that was that subverted and also stuck to the tropes. I started with some of the most famous fantasy like Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, etc. The entire cavalcade of white famous male authors. But then you kind of break in, like you kind of branch your reading out as you grow older, and I was obsessed with that kind of fantasy when I was a teenager, Lord of the Rings, etc. And I wanted to write a Lord of the Rings for India, essentially. When I was a teenager, I was about 18 or 19 when I wrote.
Did you
succeed? In a sense, I did write a fantasy novel that was kind of based on those tropes, and I tried to get it published. Obviously, it wasn't good. I was a teenager, and I did try and get it published, and I knew nothing about the publishing industry. And this was in the early days of the internet, So there were these forums where people would kind of hang out and talk about science fiction and fantasy. And I was on this site called SFF World where people could anyone could submit their work, and people would rate it and read it and whatnot. And I saw this ad on that site for this publisher, and they said they were looking for fantasy novels. And I sent them my novel, and they said, yeah, we'll publish it. Just pay us this little fee. And I knew nothing about publishing at all, so I thought this was normal, and that this was a publisher looking for young writers and, supporting them. And thankfully, it wasn't a huge amount, but I did pay them, and it did get printed, and it sold something like 8 copies, and most of those were my family members. So, it was a tremendous wake-up call, and I'm glad I did it, because the book was printed, and I saw that book in print, and it was an interesting thing to see. But I also kind of realized the realities of the publishing world, and that's what made me kind of do the research and look into it all, and that's when after that I went to college and wrote there and whatnot. But yeah, that's when my reading kind of expanded outwards, and essentially I love art across all the genres, the whole spectrum, like realist fiction, all of it. Which is why I like to kind of combine everything together, and it's so there's not my fiction tends to be. Is it working? Yeah. So my fiction tends to be all over the place, not very easily categorizable.
Okay.
For example, The Devourers, my first novel is it's sometimes categorized as horror, sometimes as fantasy, and it is all those things. I'm kind of dealing. It's set in India, in contemporary and Mughal India, so it's also kind of historical. So I love just trying to raise those boundaries and writing in a way that makes me impossible to be categorized.
To be categorized. That's good. So you're subverting it, and that's fantastic. But do you feel like fantasy can also be a powerful vehicle for exploring real-world issues, in a metaphorical sense? Whether it's political, social, economic, environmental. And do you think it brings depth and authenticity to your, fantasy narratives, to the literature that, for example, like writing a war novel where India and China go to war, it's the riparian, interrelations that is going to be affected, that India and China will go to war in the future because there will be climate change leading to water shortages. So eventually there will be water wars, and the hegemonic role will be occupied by a country like China. That's traditionally known for it. So they are going to attack India, and it's not just dystopic. I feel like when I wrote The Man Who Lost India about the future war, I feel like it's going to be a reality of our times, that we are going to face an attack by China, and whether we'll be annihilated or whether we will survive, whether we'll lose the war like we did in 1962 or whether we'll win it this time. There were so many themes to explore. So it was very rooted in our history. It was rooted in our present, it was rooted in our future as well. So do you find that that brings a lot of depth and authenticity to your fictional narratives?
I think it's more in science fiction is the good place to talk about the present through the lens of the future.
Yes, yes.
So the future is like, you can ask, what if? I talk a lot about ecology and climate problems in my science fiction books, because we can project our present in the future and say, what if in the future the Earth is not a nice place to live anymore because of all the catastrophic things happening with the climate change and everything. So it's a good way to ask questions about the society we're living in now and the problems we are going through now, and put them in the future in a very exaggerated way to see what can happen maybe in 100 years, 200 years, and say, you see, it can happen, so what can we do now?
Yes, yes.
So
I think all the linkages between our past, present, future can be visualized and therefore also almost accommodated, right, in our fictional narratives.
Yes, I wrote a book, it's a story of a multiverse, the parallel universe, where there are many versions of the Earth. So we can, so you can explore what can happen in a various way. It's the same planet, but it took like different ways at different times. and it's not the same story, exactly the same story in the different Earths, different version of Earth. So you can see, okay, what happens if something like this happens? What happens if? And it's a good way to ask questions about us now and what we can do and what we can change, and say, be careful, maybe that can happen. So I think science fiction, even if it takes place in the future, is always talking about our present.
Almost a survival of humanity as a whole, right? We're questioning our very survival all the time.
I don't pretend to see to see the right future.
Yes.
It's a kind of one of a version of a future, like what can happen if, and it can be 1,000 different ways to tell the story, but it's a good way to say, yes, be careful, maybe that can happen.
That can happen, yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball to be sure, I don't know the future, but I can
But you
imagine a
almost be
version of the
prepared,
future and say, maybe it can happen.
Absolutely. What about you, Indru?
Yeah, I think any art can, including non-realist fiction, including science fiction, fantasy, it's all talking about the real world, obviously, absolutely, because it's rooted in, we're writing in the real world, and all art, I mean, this is something people say all the time now, but it's correct. All art is political, you know, like whether or not even commercial entertainment, like even blockbuster movies, they are taking a political position. You know, for example, the Marvel movies, the MCU, one might see them as this kind of neutral political thing where it's about, oh, good defeating evil, but then you have to see the kind of hegemonic narrative that they're supporting, essentially that the United States is kind of the center, the moral center of the world, and that the heroes are all from the West, and you know, it's so that there are political realities to any kind of fiction, and I do think fantasy and science fiction absolutely can be used to talk about the present.
But you find yourself doing a lot of linkages to our sort of ancient human beliefs, you know, the superstitions. Magic plays such a central element in a lot of fantastical work. So do you guys, do you feel like it adds to the plots, and or do you think it takes away from the critical elements of your story? So is there like a fine balance that you have to draw when you're writing these stories?
It's not about superstition, it's more about mythology, I think. It's the old fantasy stories, mythology.
Yes.
So I think, yes, putting some fantasy elements in a serious subject like what if the future can be this horrible and things like that, can help us to have a distance from the drama.
Okay.
So even more when you write for kids and young adults, it's a good way to not be that hard on the subject, you know, like it's the end of the world, everybody's going to die, so it can be a little bit tough for young readers. So when you put mythological or magical and imaginary elements, you can talk about a very serious subject, but it can help to take some distance from it.
Like
and
Harry Potter, right?
Yes, exactly. And not
use
be
wonderfully the tools.
and not be so deep into the dramatic way of telling the story. So it's easier for young people, I think, and maybe for adults too, to add the magical and imaginary elements. So it's not that tough. It's a tough subject, you know. So. It's a good balance between talking about serious things and have fun writing an adventure with a lot of creatures and magic and things like that.
What about you, Indru?
I think a narrative can be both fun and still. I don't think the magic takes away and necessarily takes away from a critical aspect of the story, or keeps it from being incisive. You know, Ursula Le Guin wrote very political stories, but that were also for all ages. The Earthsea novels, you know, they do have a very kind of a backbone of humanism that, and they're very complex books, and I would strongly recommend them for children as well as well as adults. And there were many writers who were using very fantastical, I mean, even something like Game of Thrones, for example, you know, it's massively popular, but it is based on history, I mean, very loosely, of course, but, you know, you can talk about the dynamics of history, and, you know, he's kind of getting into patriarchy and monarchies and how they're tied together, etc. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to including magic in a narrative, it's magic has been a part. Again, it's all based on reality. You know, the magical thinking has been a part of us, of our societies since.
I think the use of mythology also throws a lot of the fictional, you know, the dramatic elements into sharp relief, and I think that's a wonderful usage for these fantastical stories. So let me wrap up with my final question, and then we may have a few minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. I want to quickly touch upon the approach and choices of subject, the tenor and voice that you both use, because you write in different, your target audiences are different. You write, Carina, primarily for children and young adults, and you write for adults. So what are there any sort of particular thematic choices that you're making, or are there any underlying philosophies are you thinking of your target audience when you're writing?
I can talk about everything for any age. The difference is how I tell the story. I won't write the same story for a 10-year-old kid and for a young adult. So it's not the same depth of telling something, or the dramatic situations. They are not the same with a young adult hero and a 10-year-old hero, of course. But I don't feel, I feel I can talk about everything for any age. Okay. I like to talk about difference between people and tolerance. Yeah. It's a very important subject for me. And I think to talk about this kind of subject for a young public is very important. So I can talk about tolerance in different ways for a 10-year-old and for a 20-year-old reader, but it's the same subject at the end. So I don't feel like I have to change something. I just have to change how I tell the story, because I can use the same words or the same situations depending on the age of the reader, but I talk about the same things. It's not, I don't limit myself telling me, oh, I write for a 10-year-old reader, so I can talk about that. No, I can talk about anything I want. It's just how I will tell the story that differs.
Yeah, for me it varies also from story to story, depending on the requirements. I don't really have a specific process. It's very, very chaotic, and I figure it out as I'm going.
Yeah. Okay, great. And let me throw it open. We have, I think, 3.5 more minutes. So any questions that anybody in the audience has? Chintan?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So this question is for you, Indro. What kind of space does fantasy fiction open for queer writers and readers? Because like real life is so full of many kinds of restrictions from the self and society. What does writing offer?
I think we touched on this earlier. You know, the freedom of writing in fantasy and science fiction, etc. You can imagine, because queerness is about, you know, diverting from cultural norms, essentially. It's about going against this kind of, the narrative societies and cultures impose on you and say, this is normal. So, you know, when you're writing fantasy or science fiction, you can imagine the abnormal in many ways and kind of, I don't want to say normalize it, but, you know, put it out there as something that exists, and allow people, again, of all ages, depending on who you write for, to come to terms with the fact that queerness is a part of the world, and that there is no such thing as normality. You know, everything is fluid. Categories, boundaries, borders, you know, it's all these things closing us in, and none of them is reality. They're all narratives that are imposed from the outside, you know. So, and especially in India, you know, with queerness is in a strange place because we're the queer people in India. We've got this narrative of that is supplied again by a lot of our Anglophone language around queerness is from the West, but we're also not in a place where it's still not a widely recognized thing in mainstream society. You know, it's still othered very much so, and this is the case even in the West. But they have more of a kind of somewhat mainstream acceptance within art when it comes to the presence of queerness and talking about it. So I think a lot of people in India are still closeted, you know, and I like to write about that experience as well without directly addressing that these are closeted characters, because I think a lot of people in India don't have the language to kind of describe their own queerness, you know, and the thing is, you don't always have to, you know, you can live with it and recognize it and value it. And I think fiction is a great place for people to explore that safely, you know. And yeah, I think and reading queer authors is essential, you know, and platforming them as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Are there any queer authors of fantasy fiction that you would like to name that people should read, other than you?
From India, I'm afraid, what is that? From India, from India, I'm afraid not. I don't really know.
They don't have to be Indian. They don't have to be Indian.
There's Samuel R. Delany is one of, I think, the finest writers of queer fantasy and science fiction. I strongly recommend his work, even as nonfiction about growing up in New York in during the AIDS crisis, and it's absolutely beautiful stuff and very, very kind of boundary breaking, very genre breaking. Octavia Butler is another one. There's many writers. Whenever people ask me questions about writers, I completely blank out. Forgive me, but yeah, there's many people to read.
I have a question
Any other
again
questions? Yeah.
for Indro. I'm a fan of your writing, and having read The Devourers, I'm really desperate to know more about The Last Dragon of Beaubazar, which is of course set in the city, although it's not available here. And could you tell us a bit about your last book?
Sure, thank you. It is available here as an ebook, but yeah, not as a print book, unfortunately. So The Last Dragoners of Beaubazar is about a boy who is growing up in an extended family in Beaubazar during the 90s and the 2000s. And he kind of slowly comes to terms with the fact that his extended family, are possibly refugees from another reality, from another dimension, and that they have this culture around raising and riding dragons and even eating them, and kind of and he comes to realize that his house, their family house, is a dragon's nest essentially. And so yeah, it's kind of in a realist mode, but within a fantastical context. You know, I'm trying to blur the boundaries, and I don't want to give away too much, but it is also a narrative about queerness in many ways, and of course about borders and the way societies exclude populations. But yeah, thank you.
So that's all, and I have to wrap up with a fun question for you guys. The fantasy of writers who write fantasy literature. So when we're sitting up on stage, I'm seeing people here in the audience. What are you guys seeing?
I see a rainbow.
Well, now that you mentioned that, I would like to tell a story about a similar situation where I was in a field at an event, a Baul Mela. This was the seed for my first novel, The Devourers. It was something about like what you're asking, exactly that kind of thing happened where I was at this baul mela at night, and there were these bowls playing in the tent, and everyone, everyone was kind of watching and very intoxicated. And while that music was going on, I literally had this vision, because this little kitten came up to me, and it was being hunted by a bunch of dogs, stray dogs in the field, who were kind of trying to get at it. And so I picked up the kitten and tried to protect it for a while. And the dogs were kind of approaching. And at that moment, with that tent and the music, the bowl's music, and the lights and the night around it, and it was during winter, with misty, I had this vision of being in that place hundreds of years earlier when there was nothing there, and what it must have been like to have been around a campfire listening to bards sing and like not knowing what was out there in the darkness. And that kind of became the first scene of my first novel, The Devourer. So, yeah.
What a fantastic story. And we'll end on that note. Thank you so much for joining us this early on Sunday morning. You guys have been great, and thank you so much again.
Thank you all for coming.
Anjumji and everybody for this wonderful festival. It was such a pleasure being here in Kolkata. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this session was supported by Alias Francaise du Bengale. May we have a huge round of applause for the delegates on stage. Thank you. And on that note, I would like to thank all our partners of the festival: refreshment partner Chabar, gifting partner Taifu Tea, healthcare partner AMRI Hospitals, radio partner 93.5 Red FM, event partner Navkreet, hospitality partner Kenilworth Hotel, institutional partners Apeejay School and iLead, festival partners Australian Consulate General Kolkata, alias Francaise du Bengale, Embassy of France in India, and Tollygunge Club. Session partners Oxford Junior Literary Festival, Apeejay School, Australian High Commission, alias Francaise du Bengale, and Tollygunge Club. Thank you.